The morning sun cast long shadows across the train platform in Cedar Falls, Colorado Territory, as Rosa Martinez stepped down from the dusty passenger car, her worn leather satchel clutched tightly in her gloved hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1883, and the high plains stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the jagged peaks of distant mountains that seemed to scrape the belly of the sky itself. She had traveled 3 days from Santa Fe, carrying nothing but hope and a letter that had promised her a new life. Rosa stood barely 5 feet tall, with skin the color of desert sand, kissed by sunset, dark eyes that held secrets, and hair so black it seemed to absorb the very light around it. Her dress was simple but well made, sewn by her own hands from fabric she had saved for months to buy. Around her neck hung a silver cross that had belonged to her grandmother, the only thing of value she possessed besides the skills in her hands and the determination in her heart. The platform bustled with activity. Cowboys with dust on their boots spat tobacco juice into the dirt while discussing cattle prices. Women in crisp bonnets hurried past with baskets on their arms, their eyes carefully avoiding the young Mexican woman who stood alone with her single bag. A group of miners, their faces still streaked with soot from the depths of the earth, laughed loudly as they headed toward the saloon that dominated one corner of Main Street. Thomas Whitman had described himself in his letters as a successful merchant, a man of standing in the community who needed a wife to help him build his empire in this growing frontier town. He had answered her advertisement in the Denver Post, where she had described herself simply as a hard-working woman seeking marriage and a fresh start. Their correspondence had lasted 3 months, each letter building the dream of a partnership based on mutual respect and shared ambition. Rosa smoothed her skirts and walked toward the general store where Thomas had promised to meet her, her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. She had left everything behind in New Mexico, sold her few possessions, to buy the train ticket north, burned the bridges that might have led her back to a life of washing other people's clothes and mending other people's dreams. The bell above the door of O'Brien's general store chimed softly as she entered. The interior smelled of coffee beans and leather, pickled fish and soap. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, packed with everything a frontier community might need. Behind the counter stood a woman with graying red hair and kind eyes who looked up from her ledger with a welcoming smile. "You must be Rosa," said Margaret O'Brien, her Irish accent still thick despite 20 years in Colorado. "Thomas said you'd be arriving on the morning train. I'm Maggie O'Brien. My husband Patrick and I run this place." Rosa nodded suddenly, aware of how her voice might sound to these people, how her accent would mark her as different, as other. "Yes, I am Rosa Martinez. Mr. Whitman, he said to meet him here." Maggie's smile faltered slightly, and something uncomfortable flickered behind her eyes. "Oh dear, he was here earlier, but he had to step out. Said he'd be back directly." The door chimed again, and Rosa turned to see a tall man in an expensive suit enter the store. His hair was perfectly groomed, his mustache waxed to precise points, and his boots shone with fresh polish. This had to be Thomas Whitman, the man who had written such careful, considerate letters about building a life together in the Colorado Territory. Thomas stopped dead when he saw her, his eyes widening with what Rosa first took for surprise, then recognition, then something else entirely. His gaze traveled from her face to her hands, to her dress, and back again. And with each passing second, his expression grew colder. "You're Rosa Martinez," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes, Mr. Whitman, I am pleased to finally meet you." Rosa stepped forward with her hand extended, but Thomas made no move to take it. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope ready to snap. Maggie O'Brien busied herself with rearranging items on the counter, but Rosa could feel the woman's discomfort radiating through the small space. "There's been a mistake," Thomas said finally, his voice carefully controlled but edged with something sharp. "A significant mistake." Rosa's extended hand slowly dropped to her side. "I do not understand. We have corresponded for months. You know my name. You know where I come from. I know your name, yes, but I expected—" Thomas glanced at Maggie, then back at Rosa. "I expected someone more suitable for a man in my position, someone who would fit into proper society here in Cedar Falls." The words hit Rosa like cold water. She had been foolish to think that distance might change things, that 3 months of letters might build something stronger than the prejudices that had followed her all her life. "You mean someone with lighter skin?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "I mean someone appropriate. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm a prominent businessman in this town. I can't have people thinking I've settled for less than what's expected." The cross at Rosa's throat seemed to grow heavier. She thought of her grandmother, who had raised her after her. Parents died of influenza, who had taught her to sew and cook and keep house, who had told her that someday she would find a man who would see her heart instead of just her face. "I see," Rosa said quietly. "And what of the letters you wrote? The things you said about partnership and building a future together. Those were written under different circumstances. I assumed certain things that turned out to be incorrect assumptions." Maggie O'Brien cleared her throat loudly. "Thomas Whitman, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. This young lady has traveled all this way based on your promises." Thomas straightened his vest and avoided looking directly at either woman. "Business is business, Mrs. O'Brien. I'm sure Miss Martinez understands. There's a return train to Denver this evening. I'll cover the cost of her ticket back, naturally." Rosa felt something crumble inside her chest, but she kept her spine straight and her chin up. She had faced rejection before, had learned early that the world was not always kind to women who looked like her, who carried their heritage in the color of their skin and the music of their names. But this felt different, sharper, because it came wrapped in broken promises and shattered dreams. "Keep your money, Mr. Whitman," she said. "I will find my own way." She turned and walked toward the door, her steps measured and deliberate. Behind her, she heard Maggie O'Brien's voice, sharp with indignation. "Thomas Whitman, you're a fool and a coward, and I hope you know it." Rosa stepped back onto the wooden sidewalk and into the harsh Colorado sun. The town that had seemed full of possibility when she stepped off the train now felt hostile and unwelcoming. She walked slowly down Main Street, aware of curious stares and whispered conversations that followed in her wake. News traveled fast in small towns, and she suspected that within the hour, everyone in Cedar Falls would know about the Mexican woman who had come expecting to marry Thomas Whitman and been turned away. She found herself standing in front of the small, whitewashed church at the end of the street. A wooden cross topped its simple steeple, and something about its familiar shape offered a moment of comfort. Rosa pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the cool, dim interior. Father Miguel Santos looked up from the Bible he was reading at the simple altar. He was a small man with gentle eyes and work-hardened hands, clearly someone who understood both the spiritual and practical needs of his frontier congregation. "Good morning, daughter," he said in accented English, then switched to Spanish. "You look troubled. Please, sit." Rosa sank into one of the rough wooden pews and felt the weight of the morning's humiliation settle onto her shoulders like a heavy cloak. In Spanish, she told Father Santos about the letters, the journey, the rejection. He listened without interruption, his weathered face growing more concerned with each detail. "This Thomas Whitman is not the man you deserve," he said when she finished. But do not let his blindness convince you that you have no value here. God brings people to places for reasons we do not always understand immediately. What am I to do now, Father? I have no money for a return ticket, no place to stay, no way to earn my keep. Father Santos was quiet for a long moment, considering. There is a boarding house run by Clara Jenkins. She is a good woman, a widow, who has struggled herself. She might be willing to let you work for your room and board while you decide what comes next. Rosa nodded, grateful for any kindness in this place that had shown her so little. And you think there might be work for me here? A woman with your skills? Certainly. Half the men in this territory can't sew on a button properly, and most of the women are too busy with their own families to take in extra work. You could do alterations, mending, perhaps even make dresses for special occasions. As they spoke, the church door creaked open, and a shaft of sunlight fell across the wooden floor. A tall figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, hat in his hands, clearly uncertain whether to enter or retreat. "Come in, Samuel," called Father Santos. "There's always room in God's house." The man stepped inside, and Rosa got her first clear. Look at him. Samuel Hayes was tall and lean, with shoulders broadened by years of physical work and skin weathered to the color of old leather by sun and wind. His hair was brown, shot through with premature gray, and when he removed his hat, she could see a thin scar that ran from his left temple to just below his ear. His clothes were clean but well worn, the clothes of a working man who took care of what he had but couldn't afford to replace it often. Sam's eyes met Rosa's briefly, and she saw something in them she hadn't expected, something that looked almost like recognition, though she was certain they had never met. He nodded politely in her direction before turning his attention to the priest. "Father Santos, I was hoping to speak with you about the fence around the cemetery. Some of the posts are rotting, and I thought I might replace them before winter sets in." "That's very kind of you, Samuel. But first, let me introduce you to Rosa Martinez. She's new to Cedar Falls and looking to make her way here." Sam looked at Rosa again, this time more directly. His gaze didn't linger on her skin color or make judgments about her appearance. Instead, he seemed to be looking at her as simply another person, which was more than she could say for most of the people she'd encountered since stepping off the train. "Ma'am," he said with a slight nod, "welcome to Cedar Falls. I hope you find it to your liking." There was something in his voice, a gentleness that surprised her after the harshness of her morning. This was clearly a man who chose his words carefully, who understood that words had power to heal or harm. "Thank you," Rosa replied. "I hope so as well." Father Santos looked between them with the expression of a man who saw possibilities that others might miss. "Samuel runs a ranch about 5 miles outside of town, raises cattle and horses, works hard, and keeps to himself mostly." Sam shifted uncomfortably at this description, clearly not used to being the subject of conversation. "It's nothing fancy, but it's honest work." "Honest work is all any of us can ask for," Rosa said. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went deeper than words. Both of them knew what it meant to work for everything they had, to build something from nothing, to find dignity in labor that others might overlook. Sam cleared his throat and addressed Father Santos. "About those fence posts, Father. I could start on them next week if that suits you." "That would be wonderful, Samuel. And Rosa, I'll walk with you to Clara's boarding house after we finish here. I think you'll find her more welcoming than some others in town." As they prepared to leave the church, Rosa felt something shift inside her. The morning had begun with such hope and ended with crushing disappointment. But now, in this simple sanctuary, she sensed that perhaps her story in Cedar Falls was just beginning rather than ending. Sam held the door open for her as they stepped back into the bright afternoon sun. For just a moment, their eyes met again, and Rosa saw something there that made her heart flutter like a bird testing its wings. It wasn't attraction, not yet, but it was possibility. The recognition that sometimes the most important meetings happen when we least expect them. The boarding house sat on a quiet side street, its white paint slightly faded, but its garden bright with late summer flowers. Clara Jenkins proved to be a woman of about 50, with kind eyes and practical manners, who listened to Rosa's situation without judgment and offered her a small room under the eaves in exchange for help with cooking and cleaning. That evening, as Rosa sat by the window of her tiny new room, she thought about the strange turns her day had taken. She had come to Cedar Falls expecting to marry Thomas Whitman, and instead had found rejection and humiliation. But she had also found Father Santos's kindness, Clara's practical compassion, and something else, something harder to define, in the brief encounter with the weathered rancher named Samuel Hayes. She touched the silver cross at her throat and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Her grandmother had always said that God's plans were not always the same as human plans, but they were always better in the end. Rosa wasn't sure she believed that yet, but for the first time since stepping off the train, she felt like she might be willing to find out. Outside her window, the Colorado night settled over Cedar Falls like a familiar blanket. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the town, Samuel Hayes was probably tending to his cattle, checking his fences, doing the 1,000 small tasks that kept a ranch running. Rosa found herself wondering what kind of man chose such a solitary life. What had put that scar on his temple? What stories were written in the lines around his eyes? She had come to Cedar Falls looking for one story and found the beginning of something entirely different. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself in a place that might never fully accept her. But tonight, in the safety of her small room, Rosa allowed herself to hope that sometimes the best things came not from the plans we made, but from the courage to embrace the plans that made themselves. The morning air carried the scent of wood smoke and fresh bread as Rosa made her way down the narrow staircase of Clara's boarding house. She had slept fitfully, her dreams filled with images of the long train journey and Thomas Whitman's cold rejection. But daylight brought renewed determination, and she was eager to begin proving her worth in this frontier town that seemed determined to test her at every turn. Clara Jenkins stood at the kitchen stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal while bacon sizzled in a cast iron skillet. She was a woman who had clearly learned to make the most of what life offered, her movements efficient and purposeful as she prepared breakfast for her handful of boarders. "Good morning, Rosa," Clara said without turning around. "I hope you slept well enough. The bed's not much, but it's clean and the roof doesn't leak." "It was perfect, Mrs. Jenkins. Thank you again for your kindness." Rosa tied an apron around her waist and moved to help with the morning preparations. "What can I do to help?" Clara smiled, the expression softening her weathered features. "You can slice that bread there and then help me carry these plates to the dining room. We've got 4 boarders besides yourself, and they'll be down soon expecting their breakfast." As Rosa worked, Clara continued talking in the easy way of women who had learned to find companionship in shared labor. "I heard about what happened yesterday with Thomas Whitman. Word travels fast in a town this size, especially when it involves someone acting the fool." Rosa's hand stilled on the bread loaf. "People are talking about it. Some are, but not all the talk is unkind, if that's what worries you. Plenty of folks think Thomas showed his true colors, and they weren't colors worth admiring." Clara glanced at Rosa with sharp, assessing eyes. "The question now is what you plan to do about it. I need to find work. Father Santos mentioned that people might need sewing done, alterations and such. That's true enough. Half the women in this town can barely hem a skirt properly, and the men are hopeless with anything involving a needle and thread." Clara carried a steaming platter of bacon to the dining room, then returned for the oatmeal. "But you'll need to convince them to trust you first, and that might take some doing." Rosa understood the unspoken meaning behind Clara's words. In a place like Cedar Falls, trust was something that had to be earned slowly, especially by someone who looked different, who spoke with an accent, who carried her heritage in the angles of her face and the color of her hair. The morning passed quickly as Rosa helped Clara serve breakfast to the boarders. There was old Mr. Patterson, who worked at the bank and treated Rosa with polite indifference. Young Billy Thompson, barely 18 and full of dreams about striking it rich in the silver mines. Mrs. Cartwright, a widow who had come west to live with her son and regarded Rosa with barely concealed suspicion. And Jake Morrison, a man who worked various jobs around town and seemed to enjoy knowing everyone's business. Jake Morrison lingered over his coffee longer than the others, his eyes following Rosa as she cleared plates and wiped down tables. When the other boarders had left for their daily pursuits, he leaned back in his chair with the satisfied air of a man who believed he had something important to say. "Heard you had quite the welcome yesterday," he said, his tone falsely sympathetic. "Must have been a shock, coming all this way just to find out you weren't what was expected." Rosa continued her work without looking at him. "I am sure you have other places to be, Mr. Morrison." "Just trying to be friendly. Town like this, it's important to know how things work." Jake's smile was sharp around the edges. "Thomas, Whitman's got standing here. Family's been in Colorado since before it was even a territory. Man like that has certain expectations." Clara appeared in the doorway, her expression stern. "Jake Morrison, if you don't have paying work to get to, you can find somewhere else to sit and run your mouth." Jake raised his hands in mock surrender but didn't lose his smirk, just offering some friendly advice to the newcomer. Help her understand how things are around here. After he left, Clara shook her head with disgust. "Don't pay him any mind. Jake Morrison's got a talent for stirring up trouble and then standing back to watch what happens. He's been known to carry tales from one person to another just to see if he can start a fight." Rosa nodded, but she filed away the encounter as another piece of information about the complex social dynamics of Cedar Falls. Every small town had its unofficial rules, its hierarchies and expectations, and she was beginning to understand that her place in this particular community would have to be carved out carefully. Later that morning, Clara suggested they walk to town so Rosa could introduce herself to some of the local merchants and see about finding work. The main street of Cedar Falls stretched for 3 blocks, lined with businesses that served the ranchers, miners, and railroad workers who formed the backbone of the community. Their first stop was at the general store, where Maggie O'Brien greeted Rosa with genuine warmth and immediately launched into a discussion of the sewing and mending work that regularly came through the store. "Women bring me things all the time, asking if I know someone who can fix this or alter that," Maggie explained as she showed Rosa around the store. "I do what I can, but my eyes aren't what they used to be and my fingers get stiff in the cold weather. If you're half as skilled as you claim to be, we could work out an arrangement." They negotiated terms quickly. Rosa would take on the sewing, work that came through the store, with Maggie taking a small percentage in exchange for providing the space and materials. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning, a foothold in the economic life of the town. Their next stop was the dressmaker's shop, run by a stern woman named Mrs. Pemberton, who looked Rosa up and down with the calculating eye of someone assessing potential competition. The conversation was brief and not particularly encouraging, but Mrs. Pemberton did admit that she occasionally needed help with simple alterations during busy periods. As they walked back toward the boarding house, Rosa noticed a familiar figure outside the church. Samuel Hayes stood next to a wagon loaded with fence posts, talking quietly with Father Santos. Even from a distance, there was something about his bearing that caught her attention, the way he listened carefully to what the priest was saying, the patient set of his shoulders. Clara followed her gaze and made a small sound of approval. Now there's a good man. Samuel Hayes has been nothing but decent to everyone in this town, even when he had cause to be otherwise. What do you mean? Clara glanced around to make sure they wouldn't be overheard, then lowered her voice. Sam came back from the Indian Wars about 5 years ago. Had some trouble adjusting to civilian life, if you know what I mean. There were some incidents, some drinking, some fights. Nothing truly bad, you understand? Just a man trying to find his way after seeing things no man should have to see. Rosa watched as Sam lifted one of the heavy fence posts from his wagon, his movements careful and controlled. And now? Now he keeps to himself mostly. Works his ranch, helps out when the church or the community needs something, doesn't cause any trouble for anyone. But people have long memories, especially in small towns. Some folks still remember the rough patch and forget about the good man he's become. There was something in Clara's tone that suggested she spoke from personal experience, that she understood what it meant to be judged by past mistakes rather than present character. Rosa found herself studying Samuel Hayes with new interest, wondering what kind of war experiences could mark a man so deeply that an entire town would remember his struggle to heal from them. As if sensing her attention, Sam looked up from his work and caught sight of Rosa and Clara standing across the street. He touched the brim of his hat in polite acknowledgement, and Rosa felt her cheeks warm as she returned the gesture with a small wave. "He's noticed you," Clara observed, with the satisfied tone of a woman who enjoyed a good romance. "Interesting. It's nothing like that. We barely spoke yesterday. Sometimes the most important conversations happen without words." Clara started walking again, her step lighter than it had been all morning. "Come on, let's get you back to the house so you can start on that sewing work Maggie promised you." The afternoon passed quickly as Rosa settled into the rhythm of her new life. She worked at the small table in her room, mending torn shirts and taking in the waists of dresses for women whose bodies had changed with childbearing or age. The work was familiar and soothing, her hands moving with practiced efficiency while her mind wandered over the events of the past 2 days. She had come to Cedar Falls with such clear expectations. Marry Thomas Whitman, help him build his business, create a home and family in this growing frontier town. The simplicity of that plan seemed almost laughable now. Real life, she was learning, was far more complex than the careful negotiations of letter-writing courtship. As evening approached, Clara knocked on her door with an invitation to join her for supper at the small restaurant down the street. "You've been working hard all day, and you need to meet more people if you're going to make a life here. Besides, Mrs. Henderson makes the best fried chicken in 3 counties." The restaurant was crowded with the usual mixture of working men and families that characterize Cedar Falls in the evening hours. Rosa noticed the way conversations quieted slightly when she and Clara entered, the way some eyes followed their progress to a small table near the window. She was beginning to recognize the particular quality of small-town attention, the way newcomers were studied and evaluated until they either earned acceptance or found reasons to move on. They had just ordered their meal when the door opened and Samuel Hayes walked in. He was clearly uncomfortable in the crowded space, his eyes scanning the room quickly before settling on an empty table in the corner. As he passed their table, he nodded politely to both women. "Good evening, Mrs. Jenkins, Miss Martinez." "Evening, Samuel," Clara replied. "How's the work going on those fence posts?" "Coming along well. Should have them all set by the end of the week." His eyes met Rosa's briefly. "I hope you're settling in well, Miss Martinez." "I am, thank you. Everyone has been very kind." There was something in the way he said her name, with careful attention to the pronunciation, that told Rosa he had made an effort to get it right. It was a small thing, but in a day full of small slights and subtle challenges, it felt significant. After Sam had moved to his corner table, Clara leaned forward with interest. "He's not usually one for conversation in public places. You've made an impression." "I don't think it's anything special. He's just being polite." "Rosa, honey, I've lived in this town for 15 years. I know the difference between Samuel Hayes being polite and Samuel Hayes being interested. Trust me on this." Their food arrived, and they ate while Clara pointed out various other diners and shared bits of local history and gossip. Rosa learned about the banker who had lost his first wife to cholera and married his much younger second wife within 6 months, about the mine foreman who was rumored to be skimming silver from the company, about the railroad supervisor who had 3 different women in 3 different towns, all believing they were engaged to marry him. "Small towns are like that," Clara explained between bites of chicken. "Everyone knows everyone else's business, or thinks they do. The trick is learning which stories are true and which ones are just entertainment." As they prepared to leave, Rosa noticed that Samuel Hayes was also finishing his meal. He stood as they approached his table, the automatic courtesy of a man raised to show respect to ladies. "Mr. Hayes," Clara said with a smile that Rosa was beginning to recognize as matchmaking in disguise. "Rosa here is quite the seamstress. Been doing beautiful work all afternoon. You ever need any mending done, you should bring it by the boarding house." Sam's cheeks colored slightly at Clara's obvious maneuvering, but he answered seriously. "I'll keep that in mind, Mrs. Jenkins. I'm not much with a needle myself." "Most men aren't," Rosa said, surprised by her own boldness. "It's nothing to be ashamed of." "No, ma'am, I suppose it's not." Sam looked at her with something that might have been gratitude. "Have a good evening, ladies." As they walked back to the boarding house in the gathering dusk, Clara was practically humming with satisfaction. "Mark my words, Rosa, that man will be by with some mending within the week." Rosa shook her head, but she couldn't quite suppress a smile. "You're incorrigible, Mrs. Jenkins. I'm practical. Life's too short to wait around for people to figure out what's good for them. Sometimes a little push in the right direction doesn't hurt anyone." That night, Rosa sat by her window again, looking out over the quiet streets of Cedar Falls. The day had brought small victories and small connections, the beginning of what might eventually become belonging. She thought about Samuel Hayes eating, alone in the corner of the restaurant, about the careful way he had pronounced her name, about the scar on his temple, and the stories Clara had told about his difficult return from war. Everyone in Cedar Falls, it seemed, carried their own burdens, their own histories of struggle and survival. Perhaps that was what frontier life did to people, Rosa thought. It stripped away pretense and left only the essential business of making. A life from whatever materials were at hand. She was beginning to understand that her story with Thomas Whitman had ended before it truly began. But that didn't mean her story in Cedar Falls was over. It just meant she would have to write it differently than she had planned, with different characters and different challenges and different possibilities for happiness. Outside her window, a lone coyote called from somewhere in the hills beyond town, its voice wild and lonely but somehow not sad. It was the sound of a creature that had found its place in a harsh landscape, that had learned to thrive despite the difficulties. Rosa listened until the sound faded into the distance, then closed her curtains and prepared for bed, already thinking about the work that would fill tomorrow and the slow, careful process of building a new life one day at a time. 3 weeks had passed since Rosa's arrival in Cedar Falls, and autumn was beginning to paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The work at Maggie O'Brien's store had grown steadily, with women from the surrounding ranches, bringing in everything from torn work shirts to wedding dresses that needed taking in. Rosa's reputation for fine needlework was spreading through the community, carried by satisfied customers who appreciated her skill and fair prices. On this particular morning, Rosa was hunched over a delicate piece of embroidery when Clara knocked on her door with unusual excitement in her voice. "Rosa, dear, you have a visitor downstairs, and he's brought quite a bundle of mending with him." Rosa looked up from her work, already suspecting who might be calling. Clara's prediction had proven accurate, though it had taken longer than expected. She smoothed her hair and checked her appearance in the small mirror above her washstand before making her way downstairs. Samuel Hayes stood in Clara's parlor, hat in his hands, looking somewhat uncomfortable amid the lace doilies and flowered wallpaper. At his feet sat a large canvas bag that appeared to be stuffed with clothing. When Rosa entered the room, he straightened and nodded respectfully. "Miss Martinez, I hope I'm not interrupting your work." "Not at all, Mr. Hayes. Mrs. Jenkins mentioned you might have some mending that needs attention." Sam gestured toward the bag with a slightly embarrassed expression. "I'm afraid I've let things pile up. I haven't had anyone to help with such matters for some time, and I'm not skilled enough to manage it myself without making things worse." Rosa knelt beside the bag and began examining its contents. There were work shirts with torn seams, pants with ripped knees, a winter coat with a sleeve that had been poorly patched, and several other garments that showed the wear and tear of ranch life. Everything was clean, but clearly in need of skilled repair. "This will take some time," she said, running her fingers along a particularly challenging tear in a heavy wool shirt. "But it's all manageable. When would you need these finished?" "There's no rush. I know you have other work to attend to." Sam paused, then added, "I should mention that I can pay whatever your usual rate is." Rosa looked up at him, noting the careful way he phrased the offer, as if he understood that her financial situation might be precarious and didn't want to make assumptions about what she could afford to charge. "We can discuss payment when the work is finished. Why don't you come back in a week and we'll see how much progress I've made?" Sam nodded and headed toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "Miss Martinez, I wonder if I might ask you something." "Of course." "Do you ride?" "Horses, I mean." The question caught Rosa off guard. "I learned when I was young, but I haven't had much opportunity recently." "Why do you ask?" "Well, there's a place up in the hills where the aspens are turning color right now. It's quite a sight if you're interested in such things. I thought perhaps you might like to see it, if you could spare the time." Clara, who had been pretending to dust the same lamp for the past 5 minutes, made a small sound of approval from across the room. Rosa felt her cheeks warm under Sam's steady gaze. "That's very kind of you to offer. I have an extra horse, a gentle mare named Rosie. She's used to carrying ladies back when." Sam's voice trailed off, and Rosa sensed she was hearing about something from his past, perhaps connected to the wife Clara had mentioned he'd lost. "I would like that very much," Rosa said softly. "When were you thinking?" "Sunday afternoon, if that suits you, after church services when you're free from work." They agreed on the details, and after Sam left, Clara could barely contain her excitement. She bustled around the parlor, moving objects that didn't need moving and humming under her breath. "A horseback ride to see the autumn colors," she said with satisfaction. "I told you that man was interested. It's just a friendly gesture. He's probably lonely, living out there by himself." "Rosa Martinez, you are either the most modest woman I've ever met or the most stubborn. That man just asked you on what any sensible person would call a courtship outing." Rosa returned to her room with Sam's mending, but found it difficult to concentrate on her work. The invitation had surprised her, not just because it came from someone she barely knew, but because of the careful, almost formal way he had extended it. There was something old-fashioned about Samuel Hayes, a courtesy that seemed to belong to an earlier time when such things moved more slowly and with greater deliberation. The days leading up to Sunday passed with unusual quickness. Rosa found herself paying more attention to her appearance, taking extra care with her hair, and selecting her best dress for church services. She told herself it was simply a matter of wanting to make a good impression in the community, But she knew that wasn't the whole truth. Sunday arrived bright and clear, with the kind of crisp air that promised a perfect autumn day. Rosa attended morning services at Father Santos's church, where she had begun to feel welcome among the small congregation of Mexican families and sympathetic Anglo settlers. After the service, she changed into her riding clothes, a simple brown skirt and white blouse that would be practical for outdoor activities. Sam arrived precisely at the time they had arranged, leading 2 horses down the main street of town. The mare he had promised was indeed gentle-looking, a chestnut with kind eyes and a patient demeanor. Sam's own horse was a tall grey gelding that moved with the easy confidence of an animal accustomed to covering long distances over rough terrain. "This is Rosie," Sam said, patting the mare's neck. "She belonged to my neighbor's wife before. She passed. Mrs. Patterson didn't ride much toward the end, so Rosie's been getting fat and lazy in my pasture." Rosa approached the horse slowly, letting Rosie sniff her hand before stroking the velvet nose. "She's beautiful." Sam helped Rosa mount, his hands steady and impersonal as he adjusted her stirrups and checked that she was comfortable in the saddle. Once they were both mounted, they rode out of town at an easy pace, following a well-worn trail that led up into the foothills. The countryside around Cedar Falls was more beautiful than Rosa had realized from her limited view of it from town. Rolling grasslands stretched in all directions, broken by rocky outcroppings and stands of cottonwood trees that followed the meandering path of streams. In the distance, the mountains rose like a wall against the sky, their peaks already touched with early snow. They rode in comfortable silence for the first part of the journey, both of them content to enjoy the perfect weather and spectacular scenery. Rosa found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't since arriving in Colorado. The rhythm of the horse's gait and the clean mountain air combining to wash away weeks of accumulated tension. "You ride well," Sam observed as they navigated a particularly rocky section of trail. "Better than you led me to believe. My father taught me when I was very young. He said a woman should be able to handle a horse as well as any man in case she ever needed to get somewhere in a hurry." Sounds like a wise man. He was. He died when I was 15, along with my mother. Influenza epidemic that swept through our area one winter. Sam was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm sorry for your loss. That must have been difficult, losing both parents so young. My grandmother raised me after that. She's the one who taught me to sew, to cook, to manage a household. Everything I know about being useful in the world, I learned from her. She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. She died 2 years ago, which is part of what led me to answer Mr. Whitman's advertisement. I was alone and needed to make a new start somewhere. They had reached a bend in the trail that opened onto a spectacular vista. Below them, a valley spread out like a patchwork quilt, divided by a silver ribbon of river. On the surrounding hillsides, groves of aspen trees flickered like golden coins in the afternoon sunlight, their leaves creating a sound like gentle applause when the wind moved through them. "Oh my," Rosa breathed, pulling Rosie to a stop. "It's magnificent." Sam dismounted and helped Rosa down from her horse, then led both animals to a grassy spot where they could graze while their riders rested. He had brought a small pack with water and simple food, which he spread on a flat rock that provided a natural bench overlooking the valley. "I come up here sometimes when I need to think," he said, settling beside her with careful distance between them. "There's something about seeing the land spread out like this that helps put things in perspective." Rosa accepted a piece of cheese and fresh bread, savoring both the food and the peaceful surroundings. "How long have you lived in Colorado?" "About 8 years now. Came out here after the war looking for somewhere to start over." "Clara mentioned you served in the Indian wars," Sam's expression grew more guarded, and Rosa immediately regretted bringing up what was clearly a painful subject. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry. It's all right. It's not something I talk about much, but it's not a secret either." Sam stared out over the valley, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. "I was young when I enlisted, full of ideas about duty and honor and protecting civilization from savagery. Took me a while to understand that the situation was more complicated than that. War usually is, from what I've heard. The things I saw, the things I was ordered to do, they changed me, made me question everything I thought I knew about right and wrong." Sam glanced at Rosa, then away again. "When I came back, I had trouble adjusting to civilian life. Drank too much, got into fights, couldn't sleep without nightmares. Not proud of that time." Rosa understood now why Clara had spoken about Sam's difficult period with such sympathy. The man sitting beside her had clearly fought his own battles, long after the official war had ended. "What changed?" she asked gently. "Time, mostly. And finding work that felt meaningful. Building something instead of tearing things down. Taking care of animals, growing things, being useful to my neighbors when they needed help." Sam picked up a small stone and turned it over in his hands. "I suppose I learned that a man can't run from what he's done, but he can choose what he does next." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the play of light and shadow across the valley below. Rosa found herself studying Sam's profile, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of both hardship and laughter, the way his shoulders had relaxed as he talked about finding his place in this landscape. "What about you?" Sam asked eventually. "What made you decide to come so far from home to marry a stranger?" Rosa considered how much to share, then decided that his honesty deserved the same in return. "I suppose I was running from things too, in my own way. After my grandmother died, I was alone in a place where I never quite belonged. The other Mexican families thought I put on airs because I could read and write in English as well as Spanish. The Anglo families would never accept me as an equal because of my heritage. I thought maybe in a new place, with a fresh start, I could just be myself without having to navigate all those expectations." And Thomas Whitman's rejection proved that some things don't change, no matter how far you travel. "Yes, I suppose it did." Rosa smiled ruefully, "though I'm beginning to think that might have been a blessing in disguise." Sam looked at her with interest. "How so?" "Well, if Mr. Whitman had accepted me as his wife, I would have spent my life trying to become the person he wanted me to be, instead of discovering who I actually am. Now I have the chance to build my own life on my own terms. That takes courage." "Does it?" "Sometimes I think it's just stubbornness. I don't like being told I'm not good enough, so I'm determined to prove otherwise." Sam smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "In my experience, stubbornness and courage often look very much alike." The afternoon was advancing, and they needed to start back to town before darkness fell. As they prepared to leave their scenic resting place, Sam helped Rosa mount Rosie again, his hands lingering just a moment longer than necessary on her waist. "Thank you for bringing me here," Rosa said. "It's been the most peaceful afternoon I've had since arriving in Cedar Falls. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you'd accept the invitation." "Why wouldn't I?" Sam adjusted his reins, not quite meeting her eyes. A single woman needs to be careful about her reputation, especially in a small town. Spending time alone with a man she barely knows could cause talk. Rosa considered this, recognizing the truth in his concern. She had been so focused on the simple pleasure of getting away from town and seeing the beautiful countryside that she hadn't fully considered how the outing might be perceived by others. "Let them talk," she said finally. "I'm tired of living my life according to other people's expectations of what's proper, If spending an afternoon in the mountains with a decent man damages my reputation, then perhaps this town's opinion isn't worth having." Sam looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone more conventional, I suppose. More concerned with fitting in and following the rules." "I tried that approach with Mr. Whitman. It didn't work out very well." They rode back toward town as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The conversation flowed more easily now, moving from serious topics to lighter ones as they discussed everything from the challenges of ranch life to Rosa's impressions of Colorado territory. As they approached the outskirts of Cedar Falls, Sam slowed his horse and turned to Rosa with a slightly hesitant expression. "I was wondering if you might be interested in attending the harvest dance next Saturday. It's an annual event, nothing too fancy, but most of the community turns out for it." Rosa felt a flutter of nervousness mixed with anticipation. A public event like a dance would be a clear statement that they were spending time together socially, something the entire town would notice and discuss. "I'd like that very much," she heard herself saying, "though I should warn you that I haven't danced in quite some time." "Neither have I. We can figure it out together." When they reached the boarding house, Sam helped Rosa dismount and walked her to the front door. Clara was conveniently visible through the parlor window, making no pretense of not watching their return. "Thank you again for a wonderful afternoon," Rosa said. "I'll have your mending finished by Wednesday, if you'd like to collect it then." "Wednesday sounds fine. And Rosa?" Sam paused with his hat in his hands. "I'm glad you came to Cedar Falls, even if it wasn't for the reasons you originally planned." He mounted his horse and rode away into the gathering dusk, leaving Rosa standing on the front porch, with her heart beating faster than the gentle horseback ride could account for. Clara opened the door before Rosa could reach for the handle. "Well," Clara demanded, "how was your ride?" "It was lovely. The aspens are beautiful this time of year." "I'm sure they are. And what about the company?" Rosa hung her hat on the hall peg and tried to look nonchalant. "Mr. Hayes is very pleasant company. We had a nice conversation." "Pleasant conversation, Clara followed Rosa toward the staircase. "And did this pleasant conversation include any plans for future outings?" "He's asked me to the harvest dance next Saturday." Clara clapped her hands together with delight. "I knew it. That man is completely smitten with you, Rosa Martinez, and if you can't see it, you're not as observant as I thought you were." Rosa climbed the stairs to her room, trying to process the afternoon's events and her own complicated feelings about them. Samuel Hayes was unlike any man she had ever known, combining strength with gentleness, honesty about his own flaws with genuine interest in her thoughts and experiences. The time they had spent together felt natural and comfortable, as if they had known each other much longer than a few weeks. But she also recognized the risks involved in allowing herself to care about him too deeply. She had come to Cedar Falls with her heart already bruised by rejection and disappointment. The idea of opening herself to that kind of vulnerability, again, was both thrilling and terrifying. As she prepared for bed, Rosa reflected on Sam's words about choosing what came next, rather than being defined by past mistakes. Perhaps that wisdom applied to more than just his own struggle to build a new life after the war. Perhaps it was exactly what she needed to hear as she considered whether to trust her growing feelings for a man who seemed to see her as she truly was, rather than as what someone else expected her to be. The week following Rosa's mountain excursion, with Samuel passed in a blur of anticipation and nervous energy. Word of their outing had indeed spread through Cedar Falls, as Sam had predicted, creating ripples of gossip that reached Rosa through the careful comments of her customers and the knowing looks she received while walking down Main Street. Mrs. Pemberton, the stern dressmaker, was the first to address the matter directly when Rosa delivered some finished alterations to her shop on Tuesday morning. "I understand you've been seen keeping company with Samuel Hayes," Mrs. Pemberton said without preamble, her needle suspended over the garment she was hemming. "Some might say that's moving rather quickly for a woman who only recently arrived in town under such circumstances." Rosa set down the bundle of completed work and met the older woman's gaze steadily. "Mr. Hayes has been nothing but respectful and proper in his conduct. I see no reason why accepting his invitation to view the autumn scenery should concern anyone." "It's not the scenery viewing that has people talking, my dear. It's the implications of a single woman spending unchaperoned time with a single man, particularly when both parties have certain complications in their histories." The word complications hung in the air between them like a challenge. Rosa understood that Mrs. Pemberton was referring to both her rejection by Thomas Whitman and Sam's troubled period following his return from the war. "I'm grateful for your concern," Rosa replied carefully, "but I'm quite capable of managing my own affairs and reputation." Mrs. Pemberton sniffed delicately and returned to her sewing. "Well, I suppose time will tell whether such confidence is justified. The harvest dance will certainly provide an opportunity for the community to observe how this association develops." Similar conversations occurred throughout the week, some friendly and supportive, others carrying undertones of disapproval or warning. Maggie O'Brien was firmly in Rosa's corner, declaring that Samuel Hayes was one of the finest men in the territory, and that Rosa would be lucky to catch his interest. Father Santos offered gentle counsel about the importance of proceeding thoughtfully in matters of the heart, while also defending Rosa's right to make her own choices. But it was Jake Morrison who provided the most unsettling encounter, cornering Rosa outside the general store on Thursday afternoon when she was returning from her weekly shopping. "Heard you've been making quite an impression on our local war hero," Jake said, his tone carrying an oily familiarity that made Rosa's skin crawl. "Samuel Hayes isn't usually one for courting, especially not ladies with your particular background." Rosa shifted her market basket to create more distance between them. "I don't believe my personal affairs are any concern of yours, Mr. Morrison. Now don't get all prickly with me. I'm just looking out for your interests. See, there are things about Sam Hayes that you might not know, things that could be important for a lady considering her future." "Such as?" Jake glanced around theatrically, as if ensuring they wouldn't be overheard. "Well, for instance, did you know about his first wife? Pretty little thing named Catherine came out here from Pennsylvania. They were married about 6 years, seemed happy enough, until she took sick one winter and died. Some folks wondered if Sam did everything he could to save her, if you know what I mean." Rosa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "That's a terrible thing to suggest. I'm sure Mr. Hayes loved his wife and did everything possible to help her." "Oh, I'm sure he did too. But grief can do strange things to a man, especially when it's mixed with guilt. Just something to keep in mind as you get to know him better." Jake tipped his hat with mock courtesy and sauntered away, leaving Rosa standing on the sidewalk with her mind racing. She had sensed that Sam carried deep wounds from his past, but she had attributed them entirely to his war experiences. The possibility that he was also grieving a lost wife added another layer of complexity to her growing feelings for him. That evening, Rosa found herself unable to concentrate on her sewing work. Clara noticed her distraction during supper, and eventually coaxed the story of Jake Morrison's insinuations out of her. "That man is poison," Clara declared when Rosa finished recounting the conversation. "Jake Morrison has never been happy unless he's stirring up trouble for someone else. I wouldn't believe a word that comes out of his mouth." "But there was a wife, wasn't there?" Sam mentioned something about the horse belonging to a neighbor's wife who had passed, and he seemed to have personal experience with the saddle. Clara was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal. Yes, there was a wife, Catherine. Hayes was a lovely woman, kind and gentle, with a laugh that could make anyone smile. She came out here as a mail-order bride herself, actually, about 7 years ago. The parallel between Catherine's story and Rosa's own situation was not lost on either woman. Rosa felt a strange mixture of connection and competition with this woman she had never met. This predecessor who had successfully made the transition Rosa herself was attempting. What happened to her? Pneumonia during the particularly harsh winter 3 years ago. Sam was frantic. Rode through a blizzard to fetch the doctor, tried everything anyone suggested. But she was delicate, not built for the hardships of frontier life, and the sickness took her quickly. Clara reached across the table and patted Rosa's hand. Sam blamed himself, thought he should have taken her back east when she first started feeling poorly. That's part of what led to his drinking and fighting afterward. He was trying to punish himself for failing to protect her. Rosa absorbed this information, trying to understand how it changed or didn't change her feelings about Sam. The knowledge that he had loved deeply and lost tragically made her heart ache for him. But it also raised questions about whether he was ready to risk his heart again and whether she was prepared to compete with the memory of a beloved wife. "Do you think he's ready to care for someone else?" she asked. "Honey, I think the fact that he's courting you is the best evidence that he's ready to try. Sam Hayes isn't the kind of man who would toy with a woman's affections or pursue something he wasn't serious about." Friday brought an unexpected complication when Thomas Whitman appeared at the boarding house, asking to speak with Rosa privately. Clara reluctantly showed him into the parlor, then hovered nearby with the protective instincts of a mother hen. Thomas looked uncomfortable but determined, his usual polished appearance slightly disheveled, as if he'd been struggling with some internal conflict. "Miss Martinez, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I felt I needed to speak with you before tomorrow evening's dance." Rosa remained standing, making no gesture toward hospitality. "What could we possibly have to discuss, Mr. Whitman? I've been hearing talk around town about your association with Samuel Hayes, and I feel some responsibility to warn you about the risks you might be taking." The presumption of his statement sparked Rosa's temper. "The risks I might be taking? You rejected me publicly and cruelly, Mr. Whitman. What possible right do you have to concern yourself with my welfare now?" Thomas had the grace to look ashamed, but he pressed on. "I know I handled our initial meeting poorly, and I regret any pain I caused you. But Sam Hayes is not the kind of man who can offer you the stability and security you deserve. His past is complicated, his temperament unpredictable. Unlike your own character, which proved to be so reliable and honorable. I'm trying to help you avoid making a mistake that could ruin your prospects in this community permanently." Rosa stepped closer to Thomas, her dark eyes flashing with anger. "Let me make something very clear, Mr. Whitman. You had your chance to know me as a person, to build something meaningful together, and you chose instead to judge me by the color of my skin and your own narrow prejudices. Samuel Hayes has shown me more courtesy and respect in a few weeks than you managed in months of correspondence. I would rather take my chances with an honest man who has faced his demons than with a coward who can't even face his own failings." Thomas recoiled as if she had struck him. "You don't understand what you're saying. Hayes has a reputation, problems with drink and violence. He's not suitable for a respectable woman. And apparently, in your opinion, I'm not a respectable woman, so perhaps we're well matched." Rosa moved toward the parlor door, making it clear the conversation was over. "Good day, Mr. Whitman. Please don't call on me again." After Thomas left, Clara emerged from the kitchen where she had been making no pretense of not listening to every word. "Well done, Rosa. That man needed to hear some hard truths, and you delivered them with style." But Rosa felt shaken by the encounter, not because she doubted her defense of Sam, but because it forced her to confront the reality that choosing to pursue a relationship with him would inevitably involve public scrutiny and social challenges she hadn't fully considered. Saturday arrived grey and blustery, with the kind of weather that made Rosa grateful for her warm shawl as she prepared for the harvest dance. She had spent considerable time selecting her outfit, finally settling on a deep blue dress that brought out the warmth in her dark eyes and complemented her olive complexion. It was one of the few dresses she had brought from New Mexico, made from fabric her grandmother had helped her choose for special occasions. The dance was being held in the largest room of the hotel, with the furniture pushed aside to create space for dancing and long tables set up along the walls for the potluck supper that would accompany the evening's festivities. Rosa arrived with Clara, carrying a pot of the spiced rice dish that had been her grandmother's specialty. The room was already crowded with families and couples from Cedar Falls and the surrounding ranches. Rosa recognized many faces from church and her various errands around town. But she also noticed several people she hadn't met, visitors from neighboring communities who had come for the annual celebration. Samuel appeared at her side within minutes of her arrival, looking handsome and slightly uncomfortable in a clean white shirt and dark jacket. His hair had been recently cut, and Rosa caught the scent of bay rum when he leaned close to speak over the noise of the crowd. "You look beautiful," he said simply, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." The evening began with a communal supper, with families sharing dishes and neighbors catching up on news and gossip. Rosa found herself seated at a table with Sam, Clara, Father Santos, and several other people who welcomed her warmly into their conversation. The food was hearty and plentiful, reflecting the agricultural abundance of a successful harvest season. But Rosa was acutely aware of the attention their table was receiving from other parts of the room. Some of the glances were merely curious, the natural interest in seeing how the newcomer was fitting into the community. Others carried more pointed judgment, particularly from the direction where Thomas Whitman sat with several other prominent townspeople. When the music started and couples began taking the floor for the first dance, Sam stood and offered Rosa his hand with old-fashioned formality. "Would you do me the honor?" Rosa accepted his invitation, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor, where other couples were already moving to the lively rhythm of a Virginia reel. The steps came back to her gradually, muscle memory from childhood celebrations and community gatherings in New Mexico. Sam proved to be a competent dancer, moving with the same quiet confidence he brought to everything else. When the dance called for partners to separate and rejoin, his eyes never left her face, as if he were afraid she might disappear if he looked away. "You're an excellent dancer," Rosa said during a brief pause in the music. "Catherine taught me. She said a gentleman should know how to escort a lady properly on social occasions." It was the first time Sam had mentioned his late wife directly to Rosa, and she felt the weight of that confidence. She understood that he was sharing something important with her, acknowledging the past while also making it clear that he was choosing to move forward. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was. I think she would have liked you." The second dance was a waltz, more intimate and romantic than the community dances that had opened the evening. Sam drew Rosa closer, one hand at her waist, the other holding her fingers gently as they moved together to the slower, more flowing rhythm. Rosa became aware that they were receiving increased attention from the other dancers, some approving, some clearly disapproving. She caught sight of Mrs. Pemberton whispering urgently to another woman, both of them shooting pointed looks in Rosa's direction. "People are staring," she murmured to Sam. "Let them stare. You have every right to be here, to dance, to enjoy yourself. It's not just about me. This reflects on you too." Sam spun her gently, then drew her back into his arms. "Rosa, I've spent too many years worrying about what other people think of my choices. I'd rather be judged for living my life honestly than praised for hiding from it." The waltz ended, and they remained on the dance floor for the next song, a more complicated dance that required concentration and left little opportunity for conversation. Rosa found herself swept up in the joy of movement and music, the simple pleasure of being held and guided by a man who clearly cherished her company. It was during the fourth dance that the trouble started. Rosa noticed Jake Morrison approaching through the crowd, his face flushed with drink and his eyes fixed on her with an expression that made her uncomfortable. "Mind if I cut in?" Jake asked, though his tone made it clear he wasn't really asking. "Permission?" Sam's grip on Rosa's hand tightened slightly. "The lady and I are dancing, Morrison." "Come now, Hayes. Surely you can share. After all, we're all neighbors here." Rosa could feel the tension radiating from Sam's body, could see the way his jaw tightened and his shoulders squared. She remembered Clara's warnings about his past, troubles with fighting and drinking, and suddenly understood that Jake Morrison was deliberately trying to provoke an incident. "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Morrison," Rosa said coolly, "but I prefer to finish this dance with Mr. Hayes." Jake's eyes narrowed, and his voice carried clearly enough for nearby couples to hear. "Well, I suppose that makes sense. Birds of a feather and all that. The Mexican girl and the Indian killer, quite a pair." The ugly words hit the dance floor like a physical blow. Several nearby couples stopped dancing entirely, and Rosa felt Sam's entire body go rigid with suppressed fury. "Morrison," Sam said, quietly, his voice carrying a warning that made Rosa's blood run cold, "you need to walk away right now." But Jake was too drunk or too malicious to heed the warning. "Just telling the truth, Hayes. Everyone knows what you did during the war, how many villages you burned, how many women and children you killed. Seems fitting you take up with another one of their kind now." The music stopped abruptly as the UC musicians realized something was wrong. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how Sam would respond to such deliberate provocation. For a moment, Rosa thought Sam might actually strike Jake Morrison down where he stood. She could see the battle raging behind his eyes, the old demons of violence and guilt warring with the man he had worked so hard to become. Instead, Sam released Rosa's hand and stepped back, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "You're drunk, Morrison, and you're making a fool of yourself. Go home and sleep it off before you say something you'll regret even more than you already should." Jake sneered, emboldened by what he mistook for weakness. "What's the matter, Hayes? Lost your fighting spirit along with your taste in women?" This time it was Rosa who stepped forward, her dark eyes blazing with a fury that made several people in the crowd take an involuntary step backward. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "you are a small, bitter man who can only feel important by trying to tear down people who are better than you. Mr. Hayes has served his country with honor, built a successful ranch through hard work, and contributed more to this community than you ever will. As for your comments about my heritage, I'm proud of who I am and where I come from. If that makes me unsuitable company for you, then I consider that a blessing." She turned to address the entire room, her chin held high despite the humiliation of being at the center of such a public scene. "I came to Cedar Falls, hoping to build a new life, to contribute to this community and earn my place in it. I have worked hard, treated everyone with respect, and asked for nothing more than the chance to prove my worth through my actions. If that is not enough for some of you, then perhaps the problem lies not with me, but with the narrowness of your own hearts." The silence that followed Rosa's speech was profound and uncomfortable. Then from the back of the room came the sound of slow, deliberate applause. Father Santos was clapping, his weathered face beaming with approval. Clara joined in, then Maggie O'Brien, then several others, until a significant portion of the room was showing their support for Rosa's dignity and courage. Jake Morrison, realizing that his attempt to humiliate Rosa had backfired spectacularly, slunk toward the door with what remained of his wounded pride. Sam moved to Rosa's side and offered his arm. "Shall we continue our dance?" he asked, as if nothing had happened. Rosa nodded, accepting his support gratefully, and they returned to the center of the floor as the musicians resumed playing. Other couples gradually joined them, and the evening slowly returned to its festive atmosphere, though Rosa knew that what had happened would be talked about for weeks to come. As they danced, Sam leaned close to her ear. "That was the bravest thing I have ever seen. You didn't need me to defend you at all. I needed you to let me defend myself," Rosa replied. "Thank you for giving me that chance. Thank you for defending me too. What you said about my service, about my contributions to the community, it meant more than you know." The dance ended, and they walked outside for some fresh air, both of them needing a moment to process what had happened. The night was crisp and clear, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. "Rosa," Sam said quietly, taking her hands in his, "what happened in there is going to happen again. There will always be people like Jake Morrison, people who can't see past the color of your skin or my past mistakes. If you choose to be with me, you'll have to face that kind of ugliness more than once." Rosa looked up at him, seeing the concern and love in his weathered face. "And if you choose to be with me, you'll have to face the same challenges. The question is whether we're strong enough to face them together." Sam searched her eyes in the starlight. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that I've had enough of living my life according to other people's expectations and limitations. I'm saying that I'd rather fight the world beside a good man than surrender to it alone." Sam drew her closer, his voice rough with emotion. "Rosa Martinez, I think I'm falling in love with you. I think I'm falling in love with you too, Samuel Hayes." When he kissed her, soft and gentle under the Colorado stars, Rosa felt as if she were finally coming home to herself, to the woman she was meant to be, to the life she was meant to live. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time since leaving New Mexico, she felt truly hopeful about the future. Winter settled over Cedar Falls like a quiet promise, bringing with it the kind of peace that comes after storms have. Past and truths have been spoken. The weeks following the harvest dance had transformed Rosa's position in the community from uncertain newcomer to respected member, though the change hadn't come without its challenges. Some families, emboldened by her courage at the dance, had begun bringing their mending and sewing directly to her rather than going through Maggie O'Brien's store. Word of her skill with a needle had spread to neighboring towns, and Rosa found herself with more work than she could handle alone. Clara had suggested she consider taking on an apprentice, perhaps one of the young women from the Mexican families, who attended Father Santos's church. Samuel's visits to the boarding house had become a regular occurrence, no longer hidden behind the pretense of mending or business matters. He would arrive on Sunday afternoons, properly dressed and bearing small gifts, flowers from his garden or fresh eggs from his chickens. They would sit in Clara's parlor under her watchful but approving eye, talking about everything and nothing while the autumn light faded outside the lace-curtained windows. It was during one of these visits that Sam broached the subject that had been weighing on both their minds since their declaration of love under the stars. "Rosa," he said, setting down his coffee cup with the careful precision of a man choosing his words deliberately. "I've been thinking about our future, about what it might look like if we were to build it together." Rosa's heart quickened, though. She kept her expression composed. "What kind of future are you imagining? The kind where you don't have to worry about paying for your room and board, where you have your own kitchen to cook in and your own garden to tend, where you don't have to depend on other people's charity or goodwill to make your way in the world." It was a proposal wrapped in practical terms, but Rosa heard the deeper meaning behind his careful words. She also heard the vulnerability, the uncertainty of a man who had loved and lost before. "That sounds like a very secure future," she said, gently. "But I wonder if security is enough to build a marriage on." Sam leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped between his knees. "What else would you want to build it on? Love, partnership, the feeling that we're stronger together than we are apart." Rosa paused, choosing her own words carefully. "I don't want to be rescued, Samuel. I want to be chosen. There's a difference." "I am choosing you," Sam said quietly. "Every day since I met you, I've been choosing you. When Jake Morrison tried to shame you at the dance, when Thomas Whitman comes around spreading his poison about both of us, when I wake up in the morning and think about what makes life worth living, I choose you." Rosa felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by the simple honesty of his declaration. "And I choose you, not because you can provide for me or protect me, but because you see me as I truly am and love me anyway." Clara, who had been making increasingly obvious excuses to pass through the parlor, finally abandoned all pretense and settled into her favorite chair with her knitting. "Well," she announced with satisfaction, "I suppose this means I'll need to start planning a wedding." Sam and Rosa looked at each other and began to laugh, the tension of the moment breaking into something lighter and more joyful. "Mrs. Jenkins," Sam said with mock severity, "were you eavesdropping on a private conversation?" "In my own parlor? Certainly not. I was simply available for consultation when you finally got around to making your intentions clear." The engagement was announced quietly, without fanfare, but news of it spread through Cedar Falls with the swiftness of all significant gossip. The reactions were mixed but largely positive, especially among the families who had come to know and respect Rosa through her work and her conduct in the community. Father Santos was delighted to perform the ceremony, declaring that he had seen the hand of Providence in bringing Rosa to Cedar Falls at exactly the moment when Samuel was ready to open his heart again. Maggie O'Brien immediately began planning what she called a proper wedding celebration, despite Rosa's protests that she preferred something simple. The negative reactions were predictable and came from predictable sources. Thomas Whitman made no direct comment, but his disapproval was evident in the way he avoided looking at either Rosa or Sam when their paths crossed in town. A few of the more socially prominent families expressed their concerns in whispered conversations and pointed absences from community gatherings. But these reactions troubled Rosa less than she had expected. The months in Cedar Falls had taught her to distinguish between opinions worth caring about and those that reflected more on the speaker than on her own character. The wedding planning revealed another side of the community's character. Women who had been merely polite before began stopping Rosa on the street to offer advice about everything from recipes to household management. Maria Santos, Father Santos's niece, shyly approached Rosa after church one Sunday to ask if she might help with the wedding dress, revealing a talent for embroidery that took Rosa's breath away. "I've been watching your work," Maria said, her fingers tracing the delicate stitching on Rosa's sleeve. "You have such skill, such artistry. I wondered if you might teach me some of your techniques, perhaps in exchange for helping with your dress." The collaboration that followed became one of Rosa's favorite memories of the entire engagement period. She and Maria spent hours together, bent over the ivory silk that Clara had somehow procured from Denver, creating a gown that combined traditional Mexican embroidery with the practical elegance required for a frontier wedding. Samuel, meanwhile, threw himself into preparing his ranch for a bride. He repaired the roof, installed new windows, and built additional furniture for the cabin that had been his solitary retreat for so many years. When Rosa finally visited the ranch to see the preparations, she was moved by the care he had taken to make the space welcoming for her. "I know it's not fancy," Sam said, watching her face as she examined the kitchen he had expanded, the sewing room he had created by enclosing part of the front porch, the garden plot he had prepared for spring planting. "It's perfect," Rosa said, and meant it. The cabin was modest but well built, with large windows that let in plenty of light and a stone fireplace that would keep them warm through the Colorado winters. More importantly, it felt like a home where she could truly belong, where she could build the life she had dreamed of but never quite believed possible. The wedding took place on a crisp December morning, with snow dusting the mountains, but bright, sunshine warming the air. Father Santos had decorated the small church with evergreen boughs and candles, creating an atmosphere of quiet celebration that perfectly matched Rosa's wishes for the ceremony. Rosa wore her grandmother's silver cross with her wedding dress, feeling the presence of the woman who had raised her and taught her to believe in her own worth. Samuel wore his father's watch, a simple gold piece that had been his only inheritance, but which he treasured as a symbol of the honest work and steadfast character he hoped to emulate. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, conducted in both English and Spanish to honor Rosa's heritage. When Father Santos pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed Rosa with gentle reverence, as if sealing a promise that went far deeper than the words they had spoken. The celebration that followed was held in the hotel's dining room, with food contributed by a dozen different families and music provided by a traveling fiddler who happened to be passing through town. It was exactly the kind of community gathering that Rosa had hoped to be part of when she first arrived in Cedar Falls, though she could never have imagined then that she would be at the center of it as a bride rather than an outsider looking in. As the evening wound down and the guests began to drift away, Rosa found herself standing with Samuel on the hotel's front porch, looking out over the town that had become their home. The snow had begun to fall more steadily, creating a blanket of white that softened the rough edges of the frontier settlement. "Any regrets?" Samuel asked, his arm around her waist, his voice warm with contentment. "Only that my grandmother couldn't be here to see this," Rosa replied. "She would have loved you, I think. I wish I could have known her. Any woman who raised you must have been remarkable." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the snow fall and the windows of the town glow with lamplight. Rosa thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, the pain of rejection and the joy of unexpected love, the challenges overcome and the community earned through patience and determination. "Samuel," she said softly, "do you remember what you said about choosing what comes next, rather than being defined by what came before?" "Of course. I think that's what we've done, both of us. We've chosen each other and chosen this life, despite everything that tried to convince us we didn't deserve it." Samuel tightened his arms around her, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you, Rosa Hayes." "I love you too, Samuel Hayes." The name still felt new and strange on her tongue, but it also felt right, like a key fitting into a lock she hadn't known existed. Rosa Martinez had come to Cedar Falls as a mail-order bride, seeking security and respectability. Rosa Hayes was beginning a new chapter as a woman who had found something far more valuable: A love built on mutual respect, shared values, and the courage to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As they made their way to the wagon that would take them to their new home, Rosa caught sight of Clara Jenkins, wiping tears from her eyes, while Maggie O'Brien patted her shoulder consolingly. "Those are happy tears, I hope," Rosa called out to them. "The happiest," Clara replied, "though I'm going to miss having you at the boarding house. It won't be the same without your singing in the kitchen and your laughter in the parlor." "You'll visit us often," Rosa promised. "The ranch isn't so far away, and you'll always be welcome at our table." The ride to the ranch was magical in the softly falling snow, with Samuel's strong hands guiding the horses through the familiar countryside, while Rosa marveled at how different everything looked in winter's embrace. When they arrived at the cabin, Sam carried her across the threshold with ceremony, setting her down gently in front of the fireplace, where he had already laid a welcoming fire. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hayes," he said, and Rosa felt the truth of those words settle into her bones. She had traveled hundreds of miles and endured rejection, prejudice, and uncertainty to reach this moment. She had learned to defend herself and others, to build a place in a community that hadn't immediately welcomed her, to risk love again after disappointment. Most importantly, she had learned that home wasn't a place you found, but a life you built, one choice at a time, with people who saw your true worth and chose to stand beside you. As Rosa unpacked her few belongings in the cabin that was now truly theirs, she thought about the woman she had been when she stepped off the train in Cedar Falls, and the woman she had become through the trials and triumphs of the past months. The journey hadn't been what she expected, but it had been exactly what she needed. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the Colorado landscape in pristine white. Inside, Rosa and Samuel Hayes began the quiet, ordinary, extraordinary work of building a life together, founded on love, strengthened by adversity, and blessed by the knowledge that they had found in each other not just a partner, but a true companion for whatever adventures lay ahead. The mail-order bride, who had been rejected for being too dark-skinned, had found something far more valuable than the acceptance she had originally sought. She had found a love that celebrated rather than merely tolerated her heritage, a community that had learned to value her contributions, and most importantly, a sense of her own worth that no amount of rejection or prejudice could ever diminish again. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.